Yes, so as Patty has mentioned, yes, I'm continuing the series on Gideon. Now, I'm thinking that this will be the last of this series. Yes, as Patty said, this was supposed to be a single sermon, which ended up a series of 6 sermons instead. I hope that I wouldn't continue next week because this will be this morning's sermon will talk about the death of Gideon. So unless I change my mind, this will be it. So this morning's sermon I've entitled as "Let Baal Contend Against Him." Now, just one more note. This Patty mentioned also, but yes, we are doing a study reflection on Tuesday night at 7 p.m. And we're having great discussions every week. For myself, I'm enjoying it very much, hearing your insight and trying to expound from there. So I greatly appreciate your attendance, as well as if you could put your comment or question on the reflection form on Google Doc, that would be great as well. So let's get into today's story. Last sermon, we saw Gideon and his 300 men pursuing the Midianite kings. And the story ended up revealing that Gideon, not just out of his patriotism, but out of his personal vendetta, was pursuing these 2 kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna. They had a history, they shared a history in which Gideon's brothers were killed by these 2. So we saw in the very last verse of that part of narrative, in Judges chapter 8, verse 21, then Zebah and Zalmunna said, "Rise yourself and fall upon us, for as the man is, so is his strength." And Gideon arose and killed Zebah and Zalmunna, and he took the crescent ornaments that were on the necks of their camels. So Gideon, who started as a timid, weak, doubtful man, ended up proving himself as a man of strength by killing these 2 kings of the dominant power of his day. And yet, what remained as a bit unsettling throughout this story was the conspicuous absence of the Lord throughout this part of the narrative. Up until that point, we saw God being very active, right? God was the one who called Gideon to take up this mission, this task to repel the Midianites. God was the one who confirmed and affirmed that the success will be sure. Right? And it was God even to give that success, that victory, to the hands of Gideon and his men. And yet, in this part of the story that we saw last week, God wasn't there, except in Gideon's statement legitimizing this act and that act in the name of God. So we became a bit suspicious about the ambivalency of Gideon's character, and we're carrying from there. In Judges chapter 8, verse 22, so after that great victory, that phenomenal victory, Gideon comes back to his people. And in verse 22, it says, "Then the men of Israel said to Gideon, 'Rule over us, you and your son and your grandson also, for you have saved us from the hand of Midian.'" Now, as to the precise nature of this men of Israel, we are not sure, because there were different tribes and there was no central system to govern them all. There was no king over Israel at this time. But probably quite a significant number of people came to Gideon asking him and his family to be the king. And what's the rationale behind it? What's the reason? Because Gideon has saved them from Midianites. And to this, Gideon answers. In verse 23, Gideon said to them, I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. Basically saying, God, the Lord, is king. And therefore I nor my son will rule over you. And now this sounds pious, right? Good for Gideon. He sounds quite sincere in acknowledging the rulership of the Lord and resigning himself from this rulership that is offered to him. And yet there's a bit of, maybe I'm a suspicious person, but there's something that is ambiguous here. And I think Daniel Block, an Old Testament scholar, expresses or points it out well. He comments, to be sure, Gideon appears to have deferred to Yahweh, the Lord, but it is curious that he did not correct the people's mistaken interpretation of the victory over the Midianites. Why did he not say, I will not be king over you because I am not the one who rescued you from the Midianites? It was the Lord. Good point, isn't it? I mean, the people wanted to make Gideon a king because, as they say, Gideon has saved them from the Midianites. But in turn, Gideon neither affirms nor negates that rationale. He just remains silent on that matter, on their assertion that he has saved the people. Instead, he makes the statement that, well, the Lord is the king, so I will not become the king. So I hope you see this ambivalent character being carried on in this narrative as well. While it is true that Gideon was used as a man to redeem the Israelites, it was ultimately the Lord who redeemed the Israelites. And that was the reason why God, in the first place, reduced the army to 300, wasn't it? In Judges chapter 7, verse 2, it said, the Lord said to Gideon, the people with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hand, lest Israel boast over me, saying, my own hand has saved me. Sure, the people are not saying that their own hands have saved them. They're simply saying Gideon has. And yet we wonder if the people truly recognized that it was the Lord whose hand has used Gideon to save them. And we further wonder why Gideon didn't make that point clear. But anyways, Gideon refuses to become a king. But he then makes a request, an interesting request in Judges chapter 8, verse 24. And Gideon said to them, let me make a request of you. Every one of you give me the earrings from his spoil. And there's an insertion by the author of the book of Judges, for they had golden earrings because they were Ishmaelites. Now, I'll not get into the details here, but it seems that the Ishmaelites and the Midianites are sometimes used interchangeably. So from the war, they got these golden earrings from the enemy. And Gideon asks for that. Why? Continuing reading, and they answered, we will willingly give them. And they spread a cloak, and every man threw in it the earrings of his spoil. And the weight of the golden earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold. This is approximately 42 pounds of gold, which is quite a bit. besides the crescent ornaments and the pendants and the purple garments worn by the kings of Midian, and besides the collars that were around the necks of their camels. People wanted to make him a king, so they wouldn't be hesitant, reluctant in giving up all these gold. Right? And so, what was the purpose of this? Why did Gideon ask for such things? Verse 27, it says, "And Gideon made an effort of it and put it in his city in Ophrah." So apparently, Gideon wanted to make an effort, and thus, although he said, "I wouldn't become a king," he still asked for gold. Now, what is an ephod? Ephod usually refers to a high priestly vestment. In this picture, it is worn under that breastplate. That thing that he wears under the breastplate is called an ephod. It is a special clothing. And it was often associated with Urim and Thummim. You might have heard those names. An oracular device, you might say. And as to the precise nature of this ephod, there are many, many interpretations of what this represents, because from this passage, not much is revealed about this ephod that Gideon made, right? It almost sounds like a statue, right? Made an ephod and put it in his city, right? Instead of worn. But whatever the case is, I'll just go along with what Ellen White says about the ephod. In Patriarchs and Prophets, she understood this ephod as, "From the material thus furnished, Gideon constructed an ephod and a breastplate in imitation of those worn by the high priest." So it seems that Ellen White takes this as the usual priestly garment that Gideon made out of this gold. And the question is, was Gideon a high priest, or was he associated with high priest? No, right? I mean, he was of the tribe of Manasseh. And so the question is, why did he make this ephod that is to be worn by the high priest? Ellen White further comments, "Because he had been commanded to offer sacrifice upon the rock where the angel appeared to him, Gideon concluded that he had been appointed to officiate as a priest. Without waiting for the divine sanction, he determined to provide a suitable place and to institute a system of worship similar to that carried on at the tabernacle." Now, I hope you are connecting the stories. This offering upon the rock where the angel appeared to him refers all the way back to the calling story, if you remember, when the angel of the Lord appeared before Gideon and Gideon asked for a sign. He was told to put all these meals that he had prepared, and those were burned as a burnt sacrifice, right? And then afterwards, he built an altar and offered sacrifice. And according to Ellen White, from that, Gideon inferred that he now is appointed as a priest and that he now has the right to provide a place of worship and to institute a system of worship that is similar to the one that happens in the actual tabernacle. And this is not much of a surprise if you were listening to the previous sermon, in which he seems to have overstepped. And why did he do this? I mean, what was the motivation behind it? Yes, it is not written in the book of Judges, but I thought Seventh Adventist Bible commentary offers an interesting point, in which the author writes, the religious center of the Israelites was at Shiloh, in the tribe of Ephraim, where the tabernacle was situated. I hope you remember this tribe, the tribe of Ephraim we saw last week. It may have been the arrogant attitude of the Ephraimites that made Gideon resentful toward them, to the extent that he did not care to go into their territory to worship. Now, sure, this is a speculation, but this sounds quite interesting. If you remember, earlier in the chapter, we see the Ephraimites being quite mad at Gideon, almost getting into a fight. But Gideon, at that moment, calmed these men, right? And it turns out that all this worship service was happening in the territory of the Ephraimites. And the fact that Gideon instituted a system of worship, as Ellen White says, by making this effort for himself, might be suggesting Gideon's reluctant nature of reluctancy of going to the actual tabernacle, and instead making one for himself and for his people. And what was the result of this? He refused to be a king, and yet he, in a sense, assumed a religious power, right, by instituting this system. And the result was disastrous. In Judges chapter 8, verse 27, the latter part of 27 says, and all Israel whored after it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and to his family. Now, this whored after is probably a euphemistic way of saying that they did idolatrous worship there. So Gideon became the one who, in a sense, instituted this idolatrous worship in his hometown. What he probably meant for good for his people, not to go all the way down to the Ephraimites' territory, but to provide a place of worship within themselves, became a snare, most likely contrary to his intention. In verse 28, right? So Midian was subdued before the people of Israel, and they raised their heads no more. And the land had rest 40 years in the days of Gideon. Now, this sounds a bit ironic, as Old Testament scholar Barry Webb writes. One aspect of the initial crisis, Israel's oppression by Midian, has been decisively resolved. Midian was subdued before the people of Israel and did not raise its head again. But the other and more fundamental aspect of the crisis, Israel's unfaithfulness to Yahweh, has not been resolved at all, but become more acute. And Barry Webb gets it, because as we saw earlier in this series, what was the problem? Judges chapter 6, verse 1 writes, the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord gave them into the hand of Midian 7 years. The underlying disease, the fundamental problem with the Israelites, was that they did evil in the sight of the Lord, that they whored after Baal. And that thus, the first task Gideon was called to carry out was not to kill the Midianites, but to destroy the altars and whatever pertained to the idols among his family in Ophrah, right? And then he was taken to the war with Midianites. So the threat by the Midianites was merely a symptom of this underlying disease. And what we see in the end of Gideon's story is that the symptom was treated quite well. The Midianites were subdued, and they raised its head, or their heads, no more. For 40 years, they had rest in the land. But while the symptom was treated, the disease was still within them. And then the story comes to a close and a bit of a transition to the next story, to which I probably will not get into next week. But as passing on to his son's story, we have this portion of the chapter revealing his family situation and what happened in the end of his days. In verse 29 of Judges chapter 8, it says, Jerubbaal, the son of Joash, went and lived in his own house. Now Gideon had 70 sons, his own offspring, for he had many wives. Now, up until this point, we were not told of Gideon's own family situation. Right? We might have felt the sense that because he said he was weak and he was the least of his family, he didn't have such power or influence. Right? But here we find out that actually Gideon had many wives and he had 70 sons, which is quite a great many, I believe, even in those days. And furthermore, in verse 31, and his concubine, who was in Shechem, also bore him a son, and he called his name Abimelech. And this Abimelech will be the primary character of the following story, in which Abimelech will kill all the 70 brothers of his, except one, claiming the power of his father Gideon. And what is interesting here is that Abimelech literally means my father is king. Now, we're not sure who named Abimelech, right? Was it his mother? Or was it Gideon himself? We're not sure. Because, I mean, after all, didn't Gideon refuse to become a king? And yet Abimelech's name sounds interesting. My father is king. Verse 32, and Gideon the son of Joash died in a good old age and was buried in the tomb of Joash his father at Ophrah of the Abiezrites. And on this, Laura Smith, a professor of theology, writes, Gideon refuses to be made king because he says that only Yahweh is king. And yet, Gideon takes to himself the trappings of kingship, specifically the trappings that were forbidden in Deuteronomy. Now, you may be like, whoa, what are you talking about? Now, in the book of Deuteronomy, we find God's instruction to the Israelites pertaining to kings. Now, we know that God did not really want to have a king among the Israelites, but he does give some instructions as to when they will have a king, then this king should do this or shouldn't do that. And in Deuteronomy chapter 17, 16 to 17 writes, only he, the king, must not acquire many horses for himself or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses. And he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away. Nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. Now, I've italicized some of these words, but don't they sound a bit familiar? Now, this week I was reading a book written by Christopher Wright. He's an Old Testament scholar, and this book has nothing to do with Gideon's story. But in it, Wright was commenting on this passage. And he writes, Israel's king was not to be like the monarchies of surrounding cultures. God's law put a prohibition on weapons, harems, and excessive silver and gold. A king in Israel and all the government apparatus that would surround him was not to be characterized by the classic trio: money, sex, and power. Now I'm wondering, Gideon, on the surface, refused to become a king, right? He did say, I will not rule over you nor my son, because the Lord is the ruler. But how does his action speak? I mean, he didn't acquire many horses, sure. But in the previous stories, we saw him exerting and gaining power, right? He showed his strength. He showed the man he became by killing these two Midianite kings. And in this current story, we saw him acquiring excessive gold from his people, as the surrounding countries' monarchies would do. And how about women? We see the exact language of him having many wives. And so, although it is not explicitly written in this story, his actions speak quite loud, in that his actions almost conform to those of the monarchies, the kings of the surrounding cultures, in terms of money, sex, and power, the three that are explicitly forbidden by God for Israelites kings to have. So again, we are left with this ambivalence of who Gideon was and what kind of character he was. Right? It almost seems as though he reached out for the religious power as well as political power, though not explicitly claiming to hold both of them. And the story comes to close. Verse 33 of Judges chapter 8. As soon as Gideon died, the people of Israel turned again and whored after the Baals and made Baal Berith. Berith means covenant, which is ironic. Master of covenant, their God. And the people of Israel did not remember the Lord their God, who had delivered them from the hand of all their enemies on every side. Now, if Gideon had corrected the people, no, it was not me who had delivered you, but it was God, would that have perhaps changed the situation? I don't know. Let me continue. And they did not show steadfast love to the family of Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, in return for all the good that he had done to Israel. So soon after Gideon dies, the people fall back. And it is, again, ironic that Gideon's name was changed by his father to Jerubbaal, which means let Baal contend against me. Let Baal fight against him. And it seems as though Baal has actually taken up that fight against Gideon. And it seems as though Baal has won the victory. When Gideon died, Baal continued to be worshipped. Right? And Barry Webb writes, as at the beginning of the story, Ophrah was the site of a clan cult, a family affair. At the end, it has become a center where, according to 8 verse 27, all Israel played the harlot after the ephod, presumably under Gideon's patronage. So here at Ophrah, the final irony of the story is enacted. Gideon, champion of Yahweh against Baal, presides over national apostasy. Only after his death, though, is the impiety carried to its logical conclusion. The Israelites reject Yahweh outright and make Baal Berith their god. And Gideon's story ends there with no happy ending and further disaster that will be caused in the next section by his son. The story begins with Ophrah and ends with Ophrah. The story begins with the people worshiping Baal and ends with worshiping Baal. And although Gideon had done great things by defeating the Midianites, he was not only able to treat the underlying issue, but has instead fostered, perhaps exacerbated that issue from the victory that he had won. And so this leaves us with certain tension, certain doubt toward Gideon. And I think that this will be tended toward us as well. And perhaps the lesson that I would like to bring out and let us remember from this story is that we should be careful not to mistake the symptom with the disease. For Gideon and for his people, their only and perhaps primary concern, and perhaps for the right reason, because they are obviously affecting them, was the Midianites. But they couldn't get to the root, which was their worship of Baal. So in the end of the story, it seems that Baal had really contended against Gideon and has prevailed over him. And so the fact that Gideon had this 40 years of peace, that the Midianites remained subdued while Gideon was alive, was sheer grace from God, sheer mercy by God that such state was kept. So as we come to the closing of this story of Gideon, may this unsettling feeling unsettle us as well. Like what we deem as a problem and how we deal with it, is it really getting to the root of it? Is it really addressing the issue of our relationship with God? Or are we satisfied with just treating the surface problems that are so apparent? And yes, even then, God will be, and God be merciful to us. Nevertheless, it is my prayer that we wouldn't repeat this sad ending that Gideon had done. May God help us to reach that undergirding issue, whatever the concern may be, so that the Lord fight against whatever Baal we are facing, and that he prevail. Let us pray. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for these narratives recorded in the Bible. And as we saw this story of Gideon, we are no one to be able to stand and point to him and judge him. For if we be honest, I'm sure many of us do feel and can sympathize with Gideon's ambivalence. And so it is my prayer, it is our prayer, that you would disclose to us the true disease, the thing that we have to face as we move forward. And so may you help us to exert whatever influence that we have for your good, and to leave it for the upcoming generation. We thank you for this time. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.